Hi, so okay, yeah. I'm Asha Bandari. I'm a philosopher and care theorist at the University of Iowa. And I'm a member of the advisory board for the Care Forum. So we've decided to start rotating the moderating role. So I'm moderating the session today in that capacity. And I'm very pleased to introduce Robert Gottlieb. Professor Gottlieb's research focus is on environmental and food justice, care politics, power and inequality, resource politics, alternative transportation, place-based development, global cities, and the infrastructure of everyday life. His new book, which we're discussing today, is Care-Centered Politics, and it was recently published. Professor Gottlieb delivered the Graham M. Sterling Memorial Lecture in 2014 and received the Carrie McWilliams Lifetime Achievement Award from the California Studies Association in 2015. He's also the editor of 2 MIT Press series. One of them is Urban and Industrial Environments, and the other is Food, Health, and the Environment. And they have nearly 100 titles published since 1997. So he has been a long-time environmental and social justice activist and has been engaged in researching and participating in social movements for over 60 years. Okay, so I'm, really, I found the chapter really interesting, the chapter that he sent out. And the format for today's presentation is that he's going to speak for about 20 to 30 minutes. And then we'll take questions. And I would ask people, as usual, to use the raise hand function so that I can keep track of the questions. Okay, so welcome, Professor Gottlieb.
Well, thank you, Asha. And thank you, Dan. And thanks, everybody, for joining and participating. The goals I really developed for the book as I was engaged in the research was how care, the language of care, in the context of care politics, could inform and influence the intersections of these different social movements that I've been engaged in and that I've written about and taught. Environmental justice, food justice, climate issues, issues of race and class. Going back in time into the late 1960s, when I was very active in the then Students for a Democratic Society, the student movement, I helped create an organization called Movement for a Democratic Society. And in retrospect, it was really a politics of care that informed the development of the groups that we established. Teachers for a Democratic Society, health workers for a Democratic Society, a child care organization that dealt with also elder care issues. We had an organization as part of MDS called the Urban Underground that dealt with issues of planning and transportation and environment. And that was really, in retrospect, a care politics organization. And that's the way I approach the different parts of the book that I developed in. So let me go back actually also to the late 1960s and early 70s for thinking about one of the really interesting and provocative organizations that were developed at that time called Wages for Housework, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The thing that I found fascinating in looking at the publications and the organizing work that was done through Wages for Housework was an attempt to really redefine how we thought about work. And that work, of course, needed to be considered not just in market terms as paid labor, but as activity that took place throughout one's life. And it was also a way to talk about the gender division of labor and to really blow that up. It was really, in Sylvia Federici's term, it was a provocation to say, let's rethink how work is organized and detach it from the way it is presented as a market concept. And, Wages for Housework did not have a formal agenda. It didn't have a 10-point platform, if you will, as groups at that time were wont to do. But it elevated a way of rethinking the concept of work. And it also put it in the context of thinking about the idea that one needed to deal with the exploitation around work, whether it was paid or unpaid, and have a framework that we would today call a living wage approach, or universal basic income approach, that everybody's entitled to have the resources and the income to be able to live a decent life and live well. And it also talked about the idea that the way work was separated from other daily life activities, and an argument about actually needing to reduce work hours, or think of it more as work as activity. And that concept of reducing work hours, which has been a long-standing demand, for example, of the labor movement that preceded the Wages for Housework, resonates again today. So I think if you then move forward to say the summer of 2020 and think about these kinds of issues about work, what we find is that, in fact, instead of moving towards an idea of reducing work hours, of overcoming and challenging the sort of market conception of work, we instead find that work has led to greater precarity, greater inequality. The pandemic and the climate crisis is illustrations of the intensification of a trend towards inequality and a paid labor force that was highly exploited, particularly in the context of care work, which was more crucial than, or the most critical part of the workforce, if you put it in the context of what we're called, and still are called, essential workers. The care workforce was poorly paid. It was subject to the challenges of not having stable work. So it really constituted a key element of what some folks have called the precariat rather than the proletariat. And it was also yet so crucial to the idea of the ability for the society to function. That the care workforce was celebrated when at the onset of the pandemic by people banging on their pots and pans. But it didn't deal with the fact that this was such a heavily exploited workforce. You also had the division of, or the income divide during the pandemic in that summer of 2020, and as the climate crisis intensified. You know, a huge difference in between those who were wealthiest and those who were poorest. This was the era of the pandemic billionaires, and at the same time, incredible issues around the increase in poverty and food insecurity and a range of other economic determinants. And that was also the sense that essential workers were critical, but yet their needs not being addressed. So this seems to contradict the idea, well, the wages for housework ideas resonated and really allowed for a sense of a rethinking of the structures of work. And I would argue that actually in the pandemic period, and continuing today, that it did bring forth the notion that this concept of work as a market construct had to be challenged and transformed, pretty much along the ways that was raised back in the early 70s. That's part of what I discuss in the chapter, particularly on the care economy. You do also find in the summer of 2020 new possibilities emerging. You had the Build Back Better plan, for example, of Joe Biden. I know a number of folks in the care universe were both hopeful and anticipating that that plan would elevate care in really critical ways. And there were parts of the Build Back Better plan, like the child care tax credit idea, and the notion that care was an essential part of the workforce, that were both potential changes that were going to take place, and then some actual, at least temporary changes that were made in between summer of 2020 and into early 2021. There have been setbacks since then. We have an election coming up in the US that threatens to undermine some of the breakthroughs and new ideas that were developed just a year and a half ago. But I would argue that, and I developed the idea in the book, that these ideas around work and economy were not only continuing to be important areas for potential change, but it extended outward into a range of other areas that I call, for example, the care for the earth, the climate issues that have risen to the fore. I'm going to check to see how I'm doing time-wise. You know, there's a concept I use in the book that has been developed by some other folks like Naomi Klein in her discussion of climate politics, and Rupa Marya and Raj Patel in their book Inflamed and their discussion of the concept of deep medicine, which I use in in the care-centered politics book, and that's the idea of care and repair. And I'll talk about that just a bit in relation to the ideas around climate and environment, and issues around the care economy. Care, as used by both Klein and Maria and Raj Patel, is really about a politics of transformation. That care creates a dynamic of how we rethink the structures that have led to things like the climate crisis, the kinds of environmental harms that the deep environmental harms that we experience, the health crisis, both the health care crisis and the application of the way health is utilized and structured. And repair addresses the harms that we experience and have experienced and continue to experience from, in Maria and Patel's words, 500 years of colonialism and capitalism that have created conditions that endanger the health of people, the planet, all living things. And how do you repair that? And of course, that's incredibly compelling today when we recognize that when thinking about climate, that's no longer a distant or even medium term concern, but we are experiencing continually, daily, what kind of impacts are developing in relation to the transformation, the changes of what is threatening our future around the climate. We have heat. We have extreme heat waves. We have the extraordinary issues around flooding, or as a converse, drought, or the wildfires here in California, where I am, which have literally wiped out whole communities, or the hurricanes along the East Coast that also are wiping out whole places. Within that context of how do you deal with a care and repair framework with the climate, you've had important ways of talking about how a care politics could help inform both the care side and the repair side of addressing the climate politics. When the Green New Deal was introduced in 2018 as one example of how you would try and deal with the framework around the climate politics. It was initially, it was not a formal piece of legislation, excuse me. It was a conceptual framework, and it seemed to be minimized by policymakers, far-fetched. But by the summer of 2020, it was the active language around what to do around climate or around environment was really drawing from what the Green New Deal was about. And now we're seeing yet a retreat at the same time as a desire to not let go of it entirely with the Inflation Reduction Act that was just passed in Congress. But in the book, I argue that the Green New Deal needs to have a care economy approach, or as a couple of folks have argued, it should really have a purplish tint to deal with the kinds of arguments that are raised around care, also issues of kind of indigenous knowledge of how to deal with the climate crisis. And a care economy approach dealing through the lens of the Green New Deal would also talk about dealing with the kind of anti-care realities, if you will, of hypergrowth, of compulsive consumption, that also contribute to the reasons we have the climate crisis and the environmental crisis in the future. And a care economy approach instead would talk about the need for sufficiency, and put that in the context, in a global context of what is enough, kind of a Buddhist language, if you will. What do we need to live well, with the concept of living well is not defined by the consumption or the production of things, but how we can live our lives and be well. But you can't have sufficiency without equality. So a care economy approach says you not only need to rethink and redo the structures of production and consumption, but put it in care politics terms, that would also create the ability to share the resources on a global scale. The climate crisis makes that very tangible, that the people who most contribute to the climate crisis, or the countries that contribute, need to pay their fair share, if you will, to create a level of support for those who are most vulnerable to the climate crisis, whether it's in community terms or national terms or global terms. Let me put that in the context of another area I discuss in the book, which involve the issues of race and class, and particularly how a care politics approach, and particularly a care and repair approach, would address that, those deep questions that, again, going back to the summer of 2020, were highlighted by those massive Black Lives Matter demonstrations that caused, in many ways, a kind of rethinking of how do we deal with the experiences and the harms, both historically and in contemporary terms, of that are associated with race, with class, with immigration, reasons for why people have to immigrate, whether it's the demeaning of women that was sort of the hallmark, or of transgender, the hallmark of what I call an anti-care politics. Well, how do you address that from a care and repair perspective, and a care-centered politics perspective? And that leads to the argument around, on the one hand, of reparations, and on the other, reparations being very much a repair framework, if you will, an historical reckoning. but it's also from a care perspective, the notion of redistribution of resources, of being able to make whole people who have suffered and been exploited. And so it's a change in how one approaches issues like historical reckoning around slavery and issues of race, but it's also in the context of environment and climate. You know, we're going to have in a few days an election here, and then the Global Climate Conference in Egypt, the COP27 is going to be taking place. And one of the demands that it will be made by particularly those countries who are most vulnerable is a form of reparations. There'll be great resistance on the part of the certainly the US, the EU, China, around this notion of a kind of a formal reparations framework for thinking about climate and its impacts. And because that is a form of redistribution, of moving towards this notion of equality, if you will, in a care economy framework, which needs to be applied globally. So let me end with one final comment, which is also, I think, a goal of the book. And you know, I'm giving a talk next week at a campus, and I asked what the students in particular would be interested in hearing about in the context of the book. And the feedback I got is talk to them about climate despair. There's such a sense of, are we entering a period of hopelessness? You know, and what I want to convey in that talk next week is that some of the same people who are feeling that despair are likely to be engaged in action. They're not necessarily being immobilized, you know, particularly a younger generation. And I consider that a kind of a politics, a care politics of hope, if you will, that there's a care for us as we live our lives today and for future generations. And that that hope is made possible through action. And that despair comes about when you feel immobilized. And that's, I see, as part of the purpose of the book, is to engage in a dialogue about the possibilities for hope through action and through reinvention, the sort of the care and repair framework around how our language can help inform a way of thinking about the ways we can act and bring about the kind of change that we you know, need so badly. I'll end on that note.
All right, thank you. So now let's take questions. Please use the raise hand function if you have a question. I can start us off while the questions are coming in. So I'd like to talk about the relationship between sufficiency and equality. At one point you said you can't have sufficiency without equality. And I guess I, think there's room to pull the two apart, right? So we could have a politics that meets people's needs at a sufficient level while then having further inequality. I'm not saying that's the view I advocate, but the two could come apart. So do you see the argument for, well, I guess my question for you is whether the kind of equality you're arguing for is equality of need satisfaction, or is it equality of sort of contributing to care? So is it equality in the sort of the satisfaction of needs? If so, that that might be one part of the picture. But then what do you see as the requirements of equality in the meeting of needs? So if we go beyond, or rather, are you committed to a sufficiency principle that, but then not to equality? So there could be a position where we say, okay, everyone's needs, should be met adequately. And then after that, we'll just see what happens. It's not a concern for justice. But the care politics that you're outlining, I think, is a more substantive moral view that I would think requires more substantive equality. So I wonder if you can sort of explain further your commitments to, the nature of that further equality.
Well, it definitely has to be linked together, I think. That sufficiency without equality can create a gap between how people define sufficiency, and which might well not really address why sufficiency is critical. On the other hand, sufficiency with equality from a care politics perspective is a way to create the basis for change. If you don't have equality, then you run the risk of saying this is available for some, but not for all. And there's a lively debate that goes on amongst those folks who are involved in sort of the degrowth world. What does this mean? Can we have degrowth generically without addressing, or do we need to address the question of equality? And if we address the question of equality, wouldn't that undermine the capacity for degrowth? And I think the problem with that debate is that you need to have a kind of a global reckoning of what sufficiency represents. And you cannot do that without putting in the context of how everybody participates and deals with their well-being, their capacity to live meaningful lives. And
yeah,
and that is not necessarily derived from a market framework. And that's where care comes so directly into place, that people's lives can be enriched without thinking of it in market terms. However, if you don't address how resources are shared, then you run the risk of the inability to meet those kinds of needs of people's well-being. You can't have well-being if you are displaced from your home.
so
You can't have well-being if you're being choked by a police officer and you say, I can't breathe. You need to breathe, literally and figuratively, if you're going to have well-being. And that's part of what and how you identify equality within a context also of sufficiency.
I'll take one follow-up, and then I see that Dan has his hand up for a question. So, I mean, I agree with you that the market economy, needs to be constrained, and I think you're proposing a really valuable approach to move toward a care economy. Virginia Held's work on this topic also has been very interesting. I was just teaching it in my seminar recently. And I wonder, though, if a way to fill in the details of the kind of equality required would be to say that, you're arguing for equality in political power. That's the kind of equality, or, would that be correct? Is that part of your account of equality, that it's equality of political power?
Yes, but not the sole determining factor of what equality represents. Let me put it that way.
Thanks. Okay, Dan Engster, you're next.
Hi, thank you, Bob. Thanks for that talk, and thanks for this book. I want to ask a little bit more about the way that you're thinking about the connection between care and these different areas to which you apply it. So, like in your talk, for example, you started talking about the care workforce and wages for housework, and this is a very it seems to rely upon a very material notion of care, of dependency care, someone doing a task for another person, and being remunerated for it in some form. But then more broadly, right, the second half of your subtitle is, care for the earth. And when you move to this, then I'm wondering, I guess I'd like to just hear more about how you think about this connection of these different forms of care, because, when you talk about care, supporting the care economy, that all seems, it's all kind of very, very material. And then when you move to care for the earth, you start to talk about an approach. And I'm wondering, I mean, are you sort of trying to broaden out, and are you thinking of this in terms of like you start with these kind of material interpersonal caring, and then you broaden out your scope, or are you thinking about care for the earth is an implication of caring for one another, and that we get to kind of care for the earth through the care that we have for other human beings and perhaps non-human animals? I'm just wondering what those connections are, because you're applying care to them, and I'm not sure in what sense you're thinking of care, if you're using different concepts of care in these different areas, and what you see the thread between them as.
Okay. Several different points you're making there that are important. First of all, I want to both acknowledge and thank so many of you for helping inform the development of this book. And one person I want to thank specifically on the basis your question is Joan Tronto, who and her the caring with framework that she developed, which is very much tied into thinking about care at the most intimate level, and the context in terms of relationships, but also as a form of democratic politics. And the other person, I mean, I want to thank several of you, but the other person I would thank, who has been very helpful, and I've been dialoguing with her, is Zhejiang Pu, who talks about the idea you can have an agenda that says, you've got to raise the wages of people in the care workforce. They need to be able to, which is the equality component, if you will. But she also talks about it in the context of why people who care and do care work are very much connected to a kind of caring with framework, a concept of democratic relationships between, if you will, caregiver and care recipient. It changes the dynamic, and it's really essential towards developing a democratic politics. And so I don't think they are separate entry points, if you will. One can appear more visionary. The other can be very practical. But, you know, much of my work over the years has been an effort to link what's possible, what's practical in both political terms and in terms of discourse and in terms of social movements, and what's visionary in terms of thinking what transformation is about, for creating very different kinds of structures. And you can think about that in the context of environment and climate, but you can also think about it in terms of raising the wages of care workers. Both are really essential, and changing the nature of unpaid work by creating different kinds of policies like paid family leave, which are sort of immediate needs that move towards greater equality, if you will. But you might want to, in fact, change the very notion of what that unpaid labor means in terms of redefining work, sort of a more visionary approach. And I think we needed a way to move in and intersect both those kinds of directions. I was very influenced way back in the late 60s by a book, and then his subsequent work by Andre Gortz. I talk about that in the book, going to meet him in 1967 and what that did. And he had a concept of how does change happen? And I talk about that in the book, where you can create change that's of the moment, if you will, that, like the child care tax credit or family leave, that becomes a part of a radical process of change if it's in fact leading towards that more transformative approach. And he called it structural reform. There are other terms that have been used, as opposed to a change that really not only halts at the borders, if you will, but can lead to reversals of what the goal is and how you're thinking about what kind of ultimate change you want to create. And I think that's a really valuable distinction in terms of how you develop any kind of politics, if you will, but particularly a care politics. And part of that process is to be able to redefine the terms of what we want to see happen.
Okay, we have Lorraine McCrary next.
Hi, thanks for your paper, and thanks to all of you for letting me join you. And I have to go teach it too, so just letting you know. So what I heard in your answer to Dan's question, I heard you say that it's primarily, I think, caring with others sort of for the earth. And I was wondering if caring for the earth also sort of gives rise to a relational aspect. So on page 3, you talk about mutual relationships between caregiver and care recipient. And so I guess I'm sort of asking if connecting care with environmental politics can also lead to new ways of conceiving of care, or how like a relationship of giving care and receiving care might look in environmental politics and caring for the earth.
Great. Yes, thank you for that question. One of the really interesting movements that I've been connecting to over the years is the food sovereignty movement, and which is really also has a deep framework around environment and around climate. And at one of the early climate conferences, I came across this declaration by a leading food sovereignty group, Via Campesino, which said, as part of their statement of principles, that we have to learn how to heal the earth so that the earth can heal us. And that's very much a part of the direction that environmental politics, of climate politics, of food politics can go, that is embedded in a care politics framework. And I see it resonating today, particularly in the food movement. And, I've given a couple of talks and interviews with people who are engaged in the food movement, who see a language of care is really central to where the direction of the food justice and food sovereignty movements are going. And similarly, that can be the case and has been the case to a certain extent in the environmental and climate side. And, I see Naomi Klein's work very much in this light, and Raj Patel, both of whom I mentioned, and Rupa Maria. It's a way to talk about environment and the earth we inhabit in care terms rather than kind of instrumental terms. One of the examples I give in the discussion about what happened during summer 2020 and the pandemic was how important that gardening became as a way to have a different relationship to the land and to the food that was growing on the land, and that it was also a healing activity for people at that time. And there's a long history of how gardens or food growing really contributes to that, that not just as food source and dealing with conditions of food insecurity, which is not insignificant, it's really critical, but also as healing activity. VA gardens for veterans, prison gardens. One of the programs our center set up in the late 80s was a work with different shelters for people who've been abused. And they created, we worked with to help create safe gardens. And what was really crucial was how it both operated as a food source. A lot of the abuse took place over food. The meals or where the abuse happened, which led in turn to all kinds of severe health outcomes for the people who were abused, but also has how the people who participated felt more whole, if you will. And the term that was developing at that time is very appropriate for what happened also in the pandemic, which is horticultural therapy. Or I would argue it was a care practice. And the care politics takes that and says, well, how do we broaden that? How do we make that a politics around a different relationship to how food is grown, how it's produced, how it's consumed, the experience of food. So I hope that answers what you were looking for.
Okay, the next question is from Joan Tronto.
Hi, Bob. Thank you for the talk. Thank you for writing this wonderful book, which I think does a really nice job of integrating and synthesizing all the directions that care politics requires us to move at the present. It's really nice to think about all these things fitting together. So I want to ask you some hard questions. Let's see. First, I just want to mention that Jenny Nadelsky's book, Part-Time for All, where she doesn't do this directly, but she intervenes in this wages for housework debate by arguing that everybody should have to do care. That book will finally be published in March 2023. Oxford's going to publish it. And she makes an interesting that, as you pointed out, we really have to change the way we think about work entirely. And she makes an argument for restricting work hours and requiring everybody to do some care work. But that's a footnote. I want to ask you a question about violence. And this is a topic, of course, Virginia has written about, but I'd like to hear your take on this, because to me, it's still a really hard question. So violence almost always disrupts care. It destroys care relations, it destroys trust, it destroys the possibility for care. It destroys public space, makes people more anxious, makes them retreat into the private. And if the latest stuff being said bears any resemblance to the real world, we hope not, voters are going to vote for Republicans because of the crime issue again. So it looks as if all of the talk we can have about caring for each other somehow disappears once sufficient levels of either violence or fear about violence appear. So you've been focusing on all these really positive, I love the idea of secret gardens, I love the idea of sufficiency, but how do we convince people who instead are thinking about fear, who are thinking instead about or experiencing violence? And how do we make them kind of recognize the centrality of care as a good force rather than a force of, rather than the way they often conceive of it, which is to circle the wagons and to say, I will care for my own, and that's the end of it. So let me stop there.
Great, thank you. Violence is critical to anyone's agenda, and most especially for a care politics agenda. There's a phrase that Silvia Federici used that I talked about, which is the militarization of daily life that goes on. So let me suggest a couple of different things. I already mentioned in terms of the gardens that developed in prison settings, and unfortunately disrupted to a certain extent during the pandemic. But the research that was done about those prison gardens identified a change in the recidivism rates, and most directly about how violence was viewed by the people who are engaging in the act of gardening, act of care, if you will. One of the most interesting slogans during the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, besides how people use the concept of I can't breathe, was care, not cops.
Mhm.
And so that's sort of one side of thinking about it. And then I tell a personal story involving my wife's participation in a group that had developed, a program that had developed at UCLA that was training people who would be mindfulness facilitators. And one of the participants was a police sergeant who wanted to be trained so that he could use those skills, if you will, to talk about how people in the police force needed to change and overcome the notion of the other, if you will, and the application of violence that was associated with it. He got trained, he did some really interesting work, and the difficult note is that he felt there were too many, at that point, roadblocks. So he didn't continue it. But I think there's a kernel there that's really important. And both those ways of thinking about, where and how does violence emanate, and how does it get experienced, that you really want to reduce the level of violence that's imposed on a community, which is the Black Lives Matter argument. But at the same time, you want to talk about how you change the culture from a care perspective of the people who are the institutions that are engaging in the violence, even in the context of trying to prevent the violence, they engage in violence. And the ability to develop a politics around that, I think, is crucial. I think your point is well taken that often agendas get set back when violence and militarism and war emerges to dominate how people think about not just politics, but other kinds of issues that they confront in their lives, schools, for example, and what goes on in schools. But, we're in a dynamic between what I call care versus anti-care. And we need to change the dynamic about how anti-care is institutionalized and practiced and influences language and ultimately influences how people relate to each other. And a care politics works through that to change those institutions, change those practices. And it's an unsettled debate. This election might well create a dynamic that sets us back, this upcoming election. On the other hand, we just 2 years ago went through both the pandemic and where there was really a massive outpouring saying, let's breathe. And that really requires us to think about how we relate to each other, as well as how we change the institutions that and the infrastructure of daily life that leads to the problems we're confronting.
Yeah, I would disagree with you about one thing, although we'd have to talk longer about anti-care. Because I'm kind of persuaded by the kind of argument that Arlie Hochschild's been making about Trump voters. It's not that they don't care, it's that they care in a way that is narrow, backwards looking rather than forwards looking. I mean, there are lots of things wrong with that, but it's not that it's an anti-care politics. It's a bad care politics, is the way I would describe it. I don't think I want to dismiss them as not being involved in any politics at all, or politics of care. Everybody cares. They're caring about the wrong things. What I do agree is anti-caring is the commitment, or again, it's caring about the wrong things, is the capitalist drive to ever more. And so to connect that to them, I think is right. But it's really a complicated question to know how to talk about that, what they're arguing without making it sound as if you're saying to them, you're uncaring idiots, right?
Right. Oh, absolutely. I think there's real danger in a politics that engages in othering, and it's a challenge because the dominant culture perpetuates that, and dominant institutions do perpetuate that, and the other component that I do talk about is how that then leads to a kind of a toxic individualism, that how people, how they define what care means. It's care for me and not for you.
Okay, next we have Eva Pate.
Hi there. I want to continue this discussion because one of the most puzzling thing that happened to me in teaching care ethics is that I had a woman who was formerly in the military, and she got so excited about this idea of care ethics. And the reason she got so excited about it is that she said, that's exactly what we are taught in the Army. This to care about our fellow combatants, the group that we're with. My brain isn't working, I mean, it totally resonated with her. So I'm just so puzzled about what to do with that. I mean, it's the same kind of issue of care for one, our group and not for others. But it's accentuated because it's in the military context. And so the military is viewed as the group that's viewed as deserving care, needing care, is needing care in order to be violent toward another group. So I just want to, this is just part of the continuation of the discussion. I just want to raise that point.
What that reminds me or resonates for me is some of the political work that I was engaged in the late 60s around the Vietnam War, and how one of the most powerful changes taking place were the experience of veterans who then turned against the war and talked about the way they thought about the Vietnamese, as well as people outside the military. And it was a very powerful force. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War was an amazing and fascinating organization. Some of the anti-GI coffee houses, which welcomed GIs and said, what we really are against is how, in fact, we had been manipulated to behave in a certain way. And you don't have quite that same resonance and what's happened more recently in the last decades, whether Afghanistan or Iraq, but there are elements of that. And I think more importantly is a way to change the nature of the discussion of what a military should be about, or a core of people who are in the service of the country. If they were engaging in care work, maybe they would deal with climate episodes, or maybe they would deal with the kind of environmental hazards that they might care about independently of how they think about issues around, say, race and or immigrants. And so the key is to, well, how do you communicate then caring about helping others and working with to help others during a climate episode, or thinking about the destruction of the environment in the place I live in rural Idaho. And I turned that into deciding to join the Proud Boys and go after those liberals who have demonized us, and we're going to demonize them. That there needs to be a language that communicates that one need not separate the two, that they are connected. And then we need to change the institutions so their mission, their goals are very different. They're not engaged in violence, they're engaged in care. And the more we experience these kinds of climate episodes, the more that will come to the fore, I think.
I also had another student who was in the military, and he was actually, I believe, a combatant in Iraq, and very much against the war. He was a graduate student, and he too was very excited about the ethic of care. It also occurs to me that sometimes you see these heroic stories of people doing rather amazing things to save other people. And often they're military people who've taken that idea of caring for their comrades into another situation where people are in danger. So maybe there's some potential here of, I don't know, it's a hopeful thought in the midst of all the pessimism that I know I'm experiencing right now.
You know, one final thought on that, you know, disaster response, if you will, needs to also be detached from what the market weighs in on how to do that. And in California, we had the experience of during the wildfire events of people hiring a separate force to protect their homes, which took away from the resources of being able to protect others. And that's a kind of, that's a type of anti-care practice, if you will, to say, I can save my place, but not yours. And I can do it because I have the money to make that possible.
Dan? You're up.
Thank you. Well, let me, before I go, if anybody else has a question, please jump in. I have a follow-up for Bob, but I'm happy to step aside if there's anyone else. All right. Well, so I want to go back, Bob. Earlier, you maybe it was in, I don't know, in response to one of the questions you were talking about how to create change, and I'd like to just hear you talk about that a little bit more, because you have a lot of experience, it seems, in democratic political movements. And we in the CARE movement have been interested for some time in trying to organize and get more things done, especially in this country, more support for care and creating a more caring society and culture. And it's awfully hard. And I don't, I mean, things like you're doing here, your book, I think, Care Center Politics, I think this is great. And we have this nice community where we're getting together. And I think that this is helping to, to build our own community of thinking about care. But it's kind of one step forward, one step back a lot, right? The pandemic was this moment where people were talking about care. It seemed to be coming to the fore. We had Biden, pushing for the Build Back Better, and then Joe Manchin got in the way, and a lot of that got stripped out. And now we're, I guess, coming out of the pandemic, or for some people, the pandemic ended a year ago, depending on your perspective. But I feel like it's already being forgotten. It's already like, oh, okay, yeah, that was a real problem. So I just like to hear you say a little bit more about how how to actually create this change. What steps you see as being the next ones to take.
Well, first of all, I don't think it's gone away. I think it's receded, partly because some of the dynamics of the traditional expression of politics have pushed it aside, but I don't think it's gone away. But part of what I said in the beginning, that my own focus for doing this book and the connections I want to help establish is to talk to the range of social movements that I've been either part of or talked about or talked to think about the concept of care as part of a language and a form of politics that makes connections. And there's a lot of discussion now in different amongst different social movements about how do we have these intersections. And I would like to see care being central to that process, not exclusive, but central. And that would both strengthen the very specific kinds of agendas that the people engaged in care work and care ideas would like to see happen, because it's really it expands the way people think about care, and it creates linkages that make one feel at the center of how to bring about that change, rather than you're off on one side and people are off on other sides of kind of a change agenda. And the work that, again, turning to Ajahn Poo, that she does, she's very, very focused on a very particular segment of work around care and the care workforce. But they have an expansive agenda. And one of the things I talk about in the book is January 5th and January 6th, 2021. January 5th, there was this extraordinary mobilization around the Georgia Senate race that included the people engaged in care work who were central to the mobilization and the organizing through Ajahn Poo's group and others, and had a big impact. And of course, we had at least a brief moment because of that election. There was a sense of possibility beyond what people imagined. And then, of course, the next day was January 6th. And that's the contrast, right? We're facing kind of a virulent anti-care politics, not to dismiss following Eva's point that people engaged in that politics are the other. But there is that politics, that anti-care politics out there. And yet there is a sense of making change possible that took place that same day or the day before. And I think that's a lesson that both those things can be happening. And it intensifies the need for the kind of work we do. And it also demonstrates the need to make those kinds of linkages and expressing a politics that's very much about issues like food justice and environmental justice and care, and a care economy, and seeing more directly what those linkages are. And so a good part of my own agenda is to talk to the groups outside the way the care world is conceived and say, care politics is really critical to the way we think about how we connect and organize to bring about change.
So I'm going to jump into the queue, and then I see that we have Joan Tronto, another question from Joan. So what you just said in response to Dan's question makes me kind of understand your project in a new light, which is that the way you're defining care-centered politics, I think, is very powerful as something that's kind of analogous to the way reproductive justice scholars define the RJ framework as a flexible source code that can be used in different domains. And it's, you know, I think thoroughly in the domain of non-ideal theory. And I think we do need a further development of that, you know, for our kind of political action. So having that that source code that you've linked up to these different domains has, I think, you know, significant transformative potential. So it's really exciting. But I wanted to go back to the anti-care conversation thread, because I think that one of the factors at stake in, you know, different groups' resistance to caring for others is not actually about caring for others, but rather about resistance to changing a social form in which they feel at home. This is something I've argued in my work elsewhere, you know, in some of my work. So if we look at, you know, people who have had socially privileged positions in a society where care was invisible, right? That society is changing significantly, and they're resisting that sense of feeling at ease in the world, right? The ability to navigate the world where, let's say, you know, a waitress is very sympathetic to, you know, the white man getting his cup of coffee. Maybe he's not getting that anymore because there's greater feminist awareness. People of color are not so inclined to be deferential. So these subtle micro interactions are transforming in the US quite significantly. And that, I think on an explanatory level, it needs to be understood in terms of people's sort of capacities for agency and the way those capacities for agency are in some ways diminished in this context. And that's what they're fighting for, right? They're fighting for a sense of continuing to feel at ease, which of course, you know, is not just and needs to be counteracted. But I think that that explanation is actually crucial in the current political moment as well. So I just wonder what you think about that alternative explanation, that it's not really an anti-care, it has to do instead with people's practical agency.
You know, that gets to one of the ways in which the concept of reparations has been challenged. I quote a statement that Mitch McConnell made when there was debate about 3 years ago on bringing up legislation to create a commission to look at reparations issue. And he said, "Why should I have anything to do with what my great-grandfather did, who was a slave master? And I'm not responsible." And that's an expression of, I want to be able to not confront the past to keep the privileges that I have of not being subject to the problems that those who experienced what my great-grandfather accomplished in terms of people's lives who were slaves and thereafter. So, I think dealing with the privilege issue is both important and complicated. And there needs to be a way of reframing what it means to talk about privilege and instead talk about your reckoning with what you have and historically been given to you through a care lens is liberating. That having the privilege is not liberating. Having the privilege leads to fear, leads to a sense of something is going to be taken away from me, rather than thinking about how can I be part of a process of change that benefits me as well as others. And that's, a healing process. It went, there have been parts of what happened in terms of apartheid in South Africa and the Holocaust that had elements of that, which it meant taking away that type of privilege. One of a kind of formative moment for me politically was in 1967. I went to give a talk at the counterpart of the student organization in the US and Germany. I went to Munich to give a talk to the German STS, as it was called. And when I arrived in Germany I didn't have direct descendants from the Holocaust, but I'm Jewish, and I came into Germany thinking, I felt unease, right? Here I am in the context of what we experienced. And when I arrived in Munich and was met with and then entered the hall where the German SDSs were, it was liberating. It was a sense of that the language that they had developed was the most important way, in fact, of dealing with that historical reckoning, because they were in a process of thinking about change in its multidimensional form. And similarly, that was those moments with the truth and reconciliation work that went on in South Africa had elements of that, not entirely, hasn't entirely happened in Germany, obviously. But those are moments, I think, that are ways of thinking about how to deal with privilege. And I think that those summer 2020 events, not just the pandemic, but the Black Lives Matter demonstrations brought that to the fore in both ways. It caused this concern that somehow something's going to happen to me. But it also caused a thinking through what it means and how it can be liberating to think about the past differently and what it means in the present.
Thank you. Okay, so Joan has the last question, and we just have 6 more minutes, so then we'll just have time for a brief response.
So I'll make it fast. The conversation has turned in the last 15 minutes to really the issue of despair and of ways of addressing despair. And thank you, Ethan, for saying that you were in despair, because I think since then we've been talking more about things that turn us in a more positive direction. And I just want to add one more that really has been concerning me. And it's really just a footnote to everything you've been saying, Bob. But that is, we also need to care for public space, because public space has basically disappeared. And what we know from reading like Nancy McLean's book about democracy in chains is that was part of the plan of the conservative pro-economy elite to make sure that the public we, as they put it, disappeared. And so to think about the structural change that we have to make, the Gore's suggestion that every change we make should lead in the right direction. One of the things that we have to always be thinking about is how do we make sure that a change that we try to institute reinforces the possibilities for public space rather than diminishes them. So just a comment.
Yeah, thank you for that. And, you know, the way public spaces eroded are things like privately owned public spaces that the way they've been constructed just further eliminates the idea that we all should connect to those spaces. It also can be seen in an institutional form. One of the things I talk about in the book that's a wonderful example of, if you will, public access space are what goes on with libraries. That libraries are, I think, a quintessential care institution for a number of reasons. And there have been efforts, including legislative efforts, to really reduce that public space, the access, you know, whether efforts to privatize libraries, which have fortunately not been very successful, but they're out there, whether it's to reduce the capacity of libraries to serve multiple functions, or whether it's the book burners, if you will, the people who say, we don't like libraries because of the content of that's available to the public. And what's interesting, I think, is that libraries have continued to resonate for people as valuable spaces. Even in the most conservative, one of the most conservative counties in California, in Kern County, an effort to privatize the libraries was soundly defeated. And there's partly, it's due to the recognition of this is a public space, a public institution that needs to be continued. And in fact, its capacity is expanded. Similarly, that takes place in terms of schools. Schools have the capacity to be a space that serves both the children that come to the schools or the people that come to the schools, as well as the communities in which they're part of. That the effort to make schools even greater caring institutions is a crucial agenda issue. And at the same time, to really challenge and against the efforts to privatize schools, to reduce those spaces. One of the most exciting innovations that our center got involved in was developing a program called Farm to School, which brought local farmers in connection with the school food service world. And one of my most exciting moments when we set up the very first program, it was actually at my daughter's school, was to see how the food service director, who was under stress to maintain actually schools services, food services as a profit center, was to see when we did a pilot, a farm to school pilot, and how excited the kids were. And it really changed his sense of what a food service director should be. It should be the caring person involved in a goal of health. And
thank you. Yeah.
I'm going on too long.
Well, unfortunately, I have to bring this to a close because we're at the end of our time. So there's so much more to discuss, of course, and I think it's such a, of course, everyone here is so invested in a more caring world. So this practical direction, I think, is really helpful. I do want to announce our next session for the Care Forum, which is Friday, December 9th from 12 to 1:30, and that will be Talia Schaefer speaking about communities of care. Okay, and that will be announced on the listserv. So thank you so much, Bob, and everyone for your participation.
Thank you.
All right.